February 19th, 2026, a Thursday. Across 14 nations, emergency sirens sound the all clear. The missiles have landed. The fires have stopped spreading. Governments declare survival mode activated. But here's what they won't tell you. The war didn't end when the bombs stopped falling. It ended when the ledger ran dry. Because nuclear winter isn't a military problem. It's an accounting problem. And the communities that survive won't be the ones with the biggest bunkers. They'll be the ones who understood the balance sheet of survival. Most people think nuclear winter kills you with radiation or cold. That's the illusion. The real killer is insolvency. When the sun dims and crops fail, you're not facing a weather event. You're facing the largest bankruptcy in human history. Every calorie becomes currency. Every watt of power becomes credit. And when your reserves hit zero, sovereignty ends. Not with a bang, with an empty stomach. Let's rewind to the world before the sky darkened. Supermarkets stretched aisles deep with 37 types of cereal. Heating bills arrived monthly, paid without thought. Water flowed from taps with the confidence of a central bank printing money. It felt infinite, abundant, secure. But that abundance was built on a foundation of just-in-time delivery, continental supply chains, and the assumption that tomorrow would always resemble today. It was a civilization running on credit it never knew it owed. Beneath the surface, the system was fragile. 3 days of food in most urban centers. Power grids dependent on fuel deliveries that never stopped. Water treatment requiring electricity that never failed. Modern life wasn't resilient. It was leveraged to the breaking point. One disruption away from default. Then the addiction kicked in, not to oil or gold this time, to complexity, to specialization, to the belief that experts somewhere else would handle the hard problems. Communities stopped growing food because industrial agriculture was cheaper. They stopped storing fuel because gas stations never closed. They stopped learning first aid because hospitals were 10 minutes away. Every convenience was a loan against future stability, and the interest rate was catastrophic. The antagonist wasn't a foreign army. It was dependency itself. The bondholders were the trucking companies, the power utilities, the pharmaceutical supply chains. And when the bombs fell, those creditors vanished overnight. The trucks stopped rolling on day 3. The power failed in week 1. The pharmacies emptied in week 2. Communities that had outsourced survival discovered they'd been living on margin. And the margin call was immediate. Let's walk the timeline of collapse. Day 1 after detonation. Soot enters the stratosphere. Scientists estimate 7 million tons of ash circling the globe. Sunlight reduction begins at 8%. Seems small, but crop models show that's enough to cut wheat yields by 40%, corn by 35%, rice by 50% in northern latitudes. The ledger starts bleeding before anyone feels cold. Week 3. Temperatures drop 4 degrees Celsius globally. Early frosts arrive in the northern hemisphere. Harvest season ends abruptly. Grain reserves that governments counted on for 6 months of buffer now represent the only food coming. No replanting. No second harvest. The balance sheet just became fixed. Assets frozen. Month 2. Fuel shortages cascade. Refineries offline. Distribution paralyzed. Heating oil that cost $90 a barrel now trades for food if you can find it. Natural gas pipelines require electric pumps to maintain pressure. Those pumps need power. That power needs fuel. The circular dependency breaks. Homes go cold. Hospitals go dark. The insolvency spreads like contagion. Month 4. The smoking gun moment arrives. Not in a treaty room, in a spreadsheet. Aid organizations calculate the math. Global food reserves stand at 470 million tons. Global daily consumption runs at 7.8 million tons. Simple division. 60 days of food remaining for a population of 8 billion. The liquidation sale begins, not of assets, of lives. Think about that number. 60 days, not 60 months. 2 months between humanity and famine. And that's assuming perfect distribution. No hoarding, no conflict, no transportation breakdown. In reality, the math was worse, because the reserves weren't evenly distributed, because warlords controlled the grain silos, because starving people don't wait in line. The communities that ignored this arithmetic entered freefall. Cities that depended on food imports faced default first. Urban centers with populations exceeding 2 million discovered their grocery stores held 72 hours of inventory. When trucks stopped arriving, the shelves stayed empty. Warehouses locked down. Riots began. By week 6, martial law couldn't enforce order because the enforcers were hungry too. Sovereignty dissolved when the bread ran out. Suburbs fared slightly better, but only temporarily. Lawns covered acres of unused land. But soil takes time to wake up. Yields from backyard gardens in year 1 don't feed a family. They supplement. Maybe. Root vegetables planted in panic take 90 days minimum to mature. And in a clear winter timeline, that's too late. The harvest comes after the starvation. These communities had space but no knowledge. Assets without liquidity. Rural areas held initial advantage. Farmland, livestock, wells. But even farmers discovered modern agriculture was a leveraged operation. Industrial farms required diesel for tractors. That diesel required functioning supply chains. Seed stock required annual purchases from suppliers now offline. Fertilizer required chemical plants running at capacity. When the inputs vanished, even farms faced production collapse. The machinery sat idle. The fields stayed fallow. The trap closed completely in month 7. Water treatment plants failed across 60% of urban systems. Pumps stopped. Filtration ended. Rivers and lakes became the only source. But rivers carry disease when sewage systems overflow. And sewage systems overflow when power fails. Cholera returned to the developed world for the first time in a century. Dysentery followed. Typhoid appeared in cities that thought they'd eradicated it. Let that number sink in. 60% of urban water systems collapsed. Not damaged, collapsed, because they depended on a grid that depended on fuel, that depended on a global economy that no longer existed. The infrastructure couldn't operate at half capacity. It operated at 0. Binary outcomes. Solvent or insolvent, flowing or dry. Sanitation became the second wave of bankruptcy. Trash collection ceased. Bodies went unburied. Waste accumulated in streets. The invisible ledger of public health went into default. Every infection untreated. Every wound unsterilized. Every illness uncontained. Medieval mortality rates returned in the span of a season because modern medicine wasn't medicine. It was logistics, and logistics required solvency. The communities that survived were the ones that saw this coming, not the nuclear winter itself. That was unpredictable, but the economics of scarcity, the math of collapse. They prepared their balance sheets while the sun still shone. They built assets that didn't depend on credit from distant suppliers. Food grown locally, heat generated on-site, water secured independently. These prepared communities operated on a different model, distributed resilience. Every household producing some food, every block maintaining some power, every neighborhood managing some medical care. Redundancy wasn't inefficient. It was the only insurance policy that paid out when the system failed. They decentralized survival. And decentralization is how you avoid bankruptcy when the central bank collapses. Take one example, a town of 7,000 in the American Midwest. They started community planning in 2024, not for nuclear war, for economic shock. They installed wood stoves in 300 homes. They dug 40 wells with hand pumps. They trained 200 residents in first aid. They stored 12 months of seed stock. They built 4 greenhouses heated by passive solar. The total investment cost each household about $3,000 over 2 years. When the bombs fell, that town stayed solvent. Wood stoves kept families warm when natural gas stopped flowing. Wells provided clean water when the electric pumps failed. Greenhouses kept growing kale and potatoes when outdoor crops froze. First aid training prevented deaths from infections that overwhelmed hospitals. The seed stock meant they could plant in spring even when supply chains were gone. $3,000 per household bought sovereignty. Now contrast that with a suburban neighborhood of similar size. Affluent, well-maintained, completely unprepared. They had wealth but no assets that mattered. Investment portfolios that couldn't buy firewood. Home equity that couldn't produce calories. Retirement accounts that meant nothing when the banks closed. They were rich on paper and bankrupt in practice. By month 3, they were burning furniture for heat. By month 5, they were leaving. The difference wasn't resources, it was allocation. One community invested in resilience, the other invested in returns. One built for collapse, the other assumed continuity. When the ledger settled, the investments that survived were the ones you could eat, burn, or drink. Everything else was vapor. The climax moment arrived differently for each place, but the pattern was identical, the day the last reserves emptied. The moment the community realized no help was coming. No government convoy, no aid organization, no wealthy neighbor with hidden supplies. The liquidity was gone. Default was complete. And in that moment, the only thing left was what they'd prepared themselves. For communities that ignored preparation, that moment was catastrophic. Social order collapsed when scarcity became visible. Desperation turned neighbors into threats. Violence erupted over resources that could have been shared under better planning. The absence of a distribution system meant the strong took from the weak. Might replaced right. The community dissolved into individuals fighting for survival. This is what insolvency looks like in human terms, brutality. But for prepared communities, that same moment became transformation. The last supply truck didn't come, and they realized they didn't need it. They had enough food growing, enough fuel stored, enough water secured, enough skills distributed. The balance sheet didn't zero out. It stabilized. They'd built a local economy that could function when the global one failed. They'd created sovereignty through solvency. The generational aftermath is still unfolding. We're only in year one of the darkest period. Climate models suggest sunlight won't return to normal levels until 2029. That's 3 more years of reduced growing seasons, 3 more winters of fuel scarcity, 3 more years of communities living on the reserves they built before the crisis. The debt is being paid in real time, and the interest is measured in lives. Some regions will take decades to recover. Urban centers that lost 70% of their populations to starvation and migration won't rebuild quickly. Infrastructure that collapsed stays collapsed without capital to repair it. And capital requires surplus. Surplus requires production. Production requires stability. The spiral reverses slowly, very slowly, but other communities will emerge stronger. The ones that survived didn't just endure hardship. They built new systems. Local food networks that proved functional. Distributed energy grids that proved resilient. Mutual aid frameworks that proved sustainable. They tested their models under maximum stress, and the models held. That's not weakness. That's competitive advantage. When the global economy restarts, these communities won't be dependent on it. They'll negotiate from strength. History will record the nuclear exchange. It will document the missiles and the casualties. It will debate the political failures that led to war. But the deeper story is economic. The communities that died weren't killed by bombs. They were killed by unpreparedness, by the assumption that complexity would always function, by the belief that someone else would handle survival. They went bankrupt, and bankruptcy in a resource crisis is a death sentence. The communities that lived understood a harder truth. Sovereignty is solvency. You cannot outsource your survival and expect to remain free. You cannot depend on systems you don't control and expect them to save you. Resilience isn't purchased from governments or corporations. It's built locally, slowly, with the investment of time and resources before crisis hits. It's boring, unsexy, but it's the only model that survives when the ledger goes negative. Here's the lesson documentaries like this exist to teach. Collapse doesn't announce itself with sirens. It arrives through dependency, through the slow accumulation of vulnerabilities that seem manageable until they compound, through the outsourcing of essential functions to systems designed for efficiency, not resilience. And when those systems fail, the communities left standing are the ones who rejected that bargain, who paid the upfront cost of preparation, who built balance sheets that could weather insolvency. We're not through this yet. The coldest months are still ahead. More communities will fail, more will fracture, but some will hold, and the ones that hold will teach the future how to build differently, how to value resilience over convenience, how to measure wealth in firewood and seed, not stocks and bonds, how to survive the next crisis by remembering the ledger always settles. If you want to stay ahead of history instead of becoming a casualty of it, subscribe to this channel, because the stories we tell here aren't just about the past. They're blueprints for survival. The communities ignoring this strategy today will absolutely regret it tomorrow. But the ones listening right now are already building sovereignty. 1 calorie, 1 watt, 1 gallon at a time. That's not pessimism. That's accounting. And in the end, the ledger never lies.